Welcome to Sound of Resistance channel. Russian leader Putin seems unhappy that all his plans for the invasion of Ukraine exploded in many hands. The Russian army is taking blow after blow in Ukraine. Attempts to attack by Russian troops are pulsed by the Ukrainian army. Although Russian leader Putin pushed the button to an end to the bad situation in Ukraine, he cannot prevent Russia's loss of power. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February, Russia lost many of its soldiers in clashes with the Ukrainian army. After the conflict in Ukraine, Russia's losses reached enormous proportions. The Russian army lost 80,000 soldiers in Ukraine. Russia's losses were not limited to soldiers. The Russian army lost a lot of weapons and military equipment in the Ukrainian attacks. As a result of the unstoppable loss of weapons in the Russian army, Russia's weapon stocks have eroded. The Russian army was condemned to a single bullet to fight on the Ukrainian fronts. The Russian leader made his move for the Russian army, which lost power in Ukraine. Russian leader Putin has put his plan into action, which will primarily replace the Russian soldiers who lost their lives in Ukraine. At the beginning of last month, Putin made a radical decision, announcing the mobilization of 300,000 Russian soldiers to join the Russian army in the war in Ukraine. After the declaration of mobilization, Russia boiled like a witch's cauldron. Russian soldiers who reached the Russian barracks in the Ukraine with Putin's declaration of mobilization were shocked by the sight they saw. Russian reservists thought that they would first undergo some training while joining the Russian army. However, the opinion of the Russian reservists and the practice in the Russian army contradicted each other. Russian reserve soldiers were sent to the Ukrainian fronts without any military training. As a result of this, the Russian army suffered many casualties in the clashes with the Ukrainian army. The majority of Russian soldiers killed in the conflicts in Ukraine are reserve soldiers. Russian reservists suffered the most from the wrong practice in recruiting Russia through mobilization. After the bodies of the Russian reserve soldiers who lost their lives in Ukraine were sent to their homes in Russia, the relatives of the soldiers rebelled against Putin. They complained that price for the Putin's misconduct in mobilization was paid by the Russian men, who were uneducated, unfit for military service, and had no previous combat experience. Since mobilization, Russian women have stepped up protest against the Ukrainian war. For several days this month, about a dozen women are on the border with Ukraine. Street meeting in front of the headquarters of the Western Military District in St. Petersburg, he urged the Russian army to fulfill the government's promise not to send troops to war zone in Ukraine and Russia. Russian women waited for 5 hours every day, but no one from the Russian authorities opened the doors to meet the women or receive their written objections. "No one is listening to us," said Viktoria Sannikova, who left the Siberian city of Tomsk to join the protests. "Our problems do not concern them. We have been knocking on their door for 2 months. This action is an act of desperation," he reproached the Russian authorities. Russian women finally succeeded in making their voice heard by the Russian authorities. On November 15, the doors of the headquarters were opened and the women were admitted. They presented close to 100 letters to the Russian authorities and a collective appeal from relatives of about 400 conscripts currently serving in the western Belgorod region, who say that the soldiers had come under regular fire from Ukraine and suffered casualties. Russian women have played a leading role in the small anti-war movement that has sprung up in Russia since Moscow invaded Ukraine for no reason on February 24. Public discontent with the war grew after President Vladimir Putin announced military mobilization on September 21. However, reports that Russian police sent male detainees directly to the army caused fear among Russian men. Russian men were less willing to publicly protest Putin's mobilization decision. Women increasingly dominated the protest movement, in part because many men fled or went into hiding to avoid mobilization. Slightly more than half of the 1,383 people detained in national anti-mobilization protest on 21 September were women. Of the 848 people detained in such protest on September 24, 71% were women. Women led the protest in Dagestan, Tuva, Bashkorostan and other regions. The analysis study in Russia found out that in the first week after the February invasion, at least 30% of those accused of protesting the war, 11% of those facing political protest charges in 2021, and 6% in 2019 were women. Russian women complained that Russian men recruited in the Russian army received no training whatsoever. After Putin's mobilization decision, Russian women have often reacted to the decision that there is absolutely no military training in the Russian army. In the city of Ulyanovsk in the Volga region, a group of women, the wives of the men summoned during the mobilization, which has announced to have been completed on November 1. gathered in front of a military building on November 11 to demand the withdrawal of their husbands from the war zone. Russian women say that Russian men summoned to the front in Ukraine receive virtually no relevant training and that pre-existing health problems were worsened since they were called in. People are afraid of disappointing loved ones, said Tatiana, the wife of a mobilized man from Ulyanovsk, and asked to remain anonymous for fear of backlash. I didn't attend the protest myself. I was arranging written objections, she said. Tatiana, only after the protest we received a response from the Ulyanovsk military prosecutor's office. I got the impression that they didn't even read our appeals. They wrote that there were no complaints. Apparently my husband is in the hospital for no reason, she added. Tatiana said that her husband was willing to mobilize and even voluntarily appeared before the conscription commission, but requested a postponement because he was receiving treatment for complex dental problems. Tatiana said that after her husband's recruitment office, the Russian authorities wanted to be sent directly to Ukraine. In addition to her statement, Tatiana stated that her husband has never participated in military training. The wife of mobilized Russian soldiers said they did not go to the shooting range in Ulyanovsk even once. They did drills for a week and then he was in the hospital for a week, he said. Statements from the relatives of the soldiers who were mobilized into Russian army reveal how difficult the situation of Russian men is in Ukraine. Olga Shukhanova, the mother of a 20-year-old conscript from the Astrakhan region who participated in the St. Petersburg protests, said Russian authorities tried to send her son to Ukraine twice and repeatedly pressured him to sign a volunteer contract, but so far they have successfully resisted these efforts. He is an ordinary civilian, Shukhanova said. I realize that if I don't do something fast, he will be turned into a conscript to participate in a special military operation. The Russian authorities are constantly pressuring my son, pressuring him every day. A colonel or other officer pressure him to come and sign the contract, Shukhanova said, he added. Shukhanova said that in September her son was out of touch for several days. When she called the Russian unit, she said she was told she had passed psychological tests. When I realized something was wrong, I started calling and they said my son was on the mailing list, Shukhanova said. I told him he was a soldier. They said he would sign a contract voluntarily and join special operation. So I started sending petitions everywhere, including the Department of Defense, and that must have had an effect because they didn't send it. Shukhanova added that she believes that none of the soldiers in her son's unit were sent to the war zone, possibly because of a desire to avoid scandals due to growing protest against the deployment of soldiers. Shukhanova spoke hopelessly about mobilization, but I don't know what will happen tomorrow. Shukhanova concluded, adding that she was concerned that she would be immediately mobilized for additional service as soon as her military term ends. I only have one son, what else have I got to lose, she said. Shukhanova's experience of mobilization with her own son led to her to co-found an informal council of soldiers' mothers and wives, which regularly sends calls to Putin and military officials. As the military mother and wives councils, we demand that mothers and spouses assemblies be allowed in each city to monitor whether the mobilized military units are properly trained and whether the health commission are established. We also demand the start of peace talks. Or at least we demand that the president act in his direction instead of threatening the whole world with dirty bombs, he said. Shukhanova added that the Council of Soldiers, Mothers and Wives has held online meetings with participants from all regions of Russia. Since the signing of the mobilization decree, the group has stepped up campaigns of protest and appeal, often ignored by authorities, she said. Russian women expressed that they had no hope from the Russian authorities. Russian women see that their only hope for the mobilization imposed by Russian leader Putin is that the Russian people will organize and achieve a result. At the Council of Soldiers, Mothers and Wives, our calls are necessary to force the Russian authorities to do something and prove to them that the people are watching them. I'm sure we will achieve something. Russia's practice of expedition evokes the feeling that we live in the Middle Ages, not in a modern society. If Russian leader Putin had predicted that the Russian people would suffer so much, could he still continue to make the same decision? Perhaps we will be able to learn the answer to this question with the end of the war in Ukraine. But still, it is not too late for anything. Wherever the loss is returned, it is a profit. The future of Russian reservists may be reshaped by the words that come out of Putin's lips. Thank you for watching us.